A woman believed she had lost her husband forever. A soldier taken by war, leaving behind only memories and silence. For 15 years, she carried that grief in her heart. But one day, a single message shattered everything she thought she knew and led her into a story filled with secrets, hope, and a love that refused to die. What happens next will take you on a journey you won't forget. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you and see how far this story can reach across hearts and homes. The day Margaret Ellis lost her husband was the kind of day that never fully disappears from memory, no matter how many years slip quietly by. It was early, autumn in their small Pennsylvania town, the trees blazing with reds and golds like someone had set fire to the hills. Maggie had been folding laundry on the living room couch, her 5-year-old daughter Emily playing quietly at her feet with her dollhouse, humming a tune Maggie couldn't quite place. The house smelled of apples and cinnamon, thanks to a candle burning on the windowsill. It was one of those moments that felt peacefully ordinary, until the knock came. There was something about the sound of it. Not hurried, not loud, but steady, deliberate. Maggie glanced at the clock. Just past noon. She wasn't expecting anyone. Emily looked up too, sensing something in her mother's sudden stillness. Maggie stood, smoothed down her jeans, and walked to the door. The sight that greeted her on the porch would change her life forever. 2 men stood there, solemn and stiff in uniform, army-dress blues. The older one, with silver at his temples and lines around his eyes, spoke first. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, voice low and formal. "May we come in?" She already knew. Some part of her, deep in the marrow of her bones, already knew. She didn't even answer, just stepped aside and let them in, feeling the air grow heavier around her. They sat on the edge of the couch, both hats in hand, and delivered the words like they'd done it 100 times before. James Ellis, Sergeant First Class, killed in action during a mission in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. An ambush, they said. No recovered remains. The area too dangerous to retrieve bodies. Presumed dead. Regret. Honor. Sacrifice. They handed her a folder. A few official documents. A flag, crisply folded into a triangle. Maggie sat stiffly, arms wrapped around her ribs as though she were trying to hold herself together, while her daughter stared wide-eyed from the floor, clutching her doll to her chest. The men stayed a little while, offered condolences, left numbers she never called. After they were gone, the house felt quieter than it ever had. Even Emily stopped humming. Maggie sat in silence, the folder untouched on the coffee table, the flag like a wound in the center of the room. That night, after Emily had finally drifted, to sleep wrapped in her father's old t-shirt, Maggie opened the top drawer of their bedroom dresser and pulled out a letter. It had arrived just a week earlier, postmarked from overseas. James's handwriting strong and steady across the envelope. She had read it a dozen times already, but now she read it again, slowly, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something different. "Dear Mags," it began. "If you're reading this, I hope it's not because anything's happened. But I know this place and I know the risks, so I want to say this while I still can. You've made my life the kind of life a man dreams about. I think about you and Emily every day. I see your face when I wake up, even here. I'm counting the days until I can come home, mow the lawn, burn the meat on the grill, and fall asleep next to you again. Tell Emily Daddy loves her to the moon and back. Always. Yours, James." She traced his signature with her fingertip. "To the moon and back," she whispered, and then pressed the letter to her chest and let the sobs come. Not polite. Pretty. Tears, but soul-deep grief. The kind that shakes the body and leaves a woman gasping for air like she's drowning. In the days that followed, sympathy cards filled the mailbox. Neighbors brought casseroles and peach cobblers and offered help she didn't know how to accept. Her parents came down from Ohio and stayed for a week, taking care of Emily while Maggie went through the motions. She wore black to the town memorial service, sat in the front row holding Emily's small hand in her own, and listened as James's name was read aloud among the fallen. There was no body, no casket, Just a photograph on an easel and a pair of boots on the stage. But it was enough. Too much, really. The Army gave her a medal and called her a Gold Star widow. They told her James was a hero. And maybe he was. But in the quiet hours of night when the house creaked and groaned and the wind rattled the shutters, Maggie didn't want a hero. She wanted her husband. She wanted one more kiss goodbye, one more night tangled up together in their bed, one more chance to tell him not to go. But that chance was gone. Stolen by a war half a world away, in a country she couldn't even point to on a map before James was sent there. She found herself staring at the news more often now, scanning the headlines for details that never came. She would never know the full story, only the vague version the Army provided. Killed in action, like some kind of punctuation at the end of a sentence too painful to finish. Still, life went on, as it always does. Emily needed lunches packed and rides to kindergarten and bedtime stories. Maggie got up each morning, showered, braided Emily's hair and tried not to cry in front of her. But at night, once the lights were out, she'd pull out James's letter again, unfolding it with shaking hands, rereading the words like a prayer. 15 years would pass. Seasons would change. Birthdays would come and go, and Maggie would learn to live with the ache. But what she didn't know, what no one could have known, was that James's story wasn't finished. And one day, long after the world had moved on, a message would arrive that would upend everything she believed about that terrible autumn day. The seasons rolled forward like they always do, unbothered by the lives they quietly passed through. For Margaret Ellis, each new morning felt like walking through fog, doing what needed to be done, but never quite feeling awake. The grief had settled into her bones, heavy and familiar, no longer sharp but constant like a dull ache in the cold. After James's death, life didn't stop, but it certainly didn't move the same. There were bills to pay, lunches to pack, and a little girl to raise. Emily was only 5 when the Army men stood in their living room with faces full of sorrow and uniforms that smelled like starch and finality. She hadn't fully grasped what death meant, but she understood enough to know her daddy wasn't coming home. At night, she'd sleep with his photo under her pillow, whispering goodnight to it the way she used to whisper through the bedroom door when he was deployed. Maggie went back to work 6 months after the service, not because she was ready, but because the silence of the house was starting to feel like it might swallow her whole. She took a part-time job at the town library, a quiet little place tucked between the post office and a bakery that always smelled like vanilla and rising dough. The routine gave her something to hold on to. She'd shelve books, help elderly patrons with the computers, and read stories to preschoolers on Tuesday mornings. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And in those days, steady was everything. She sold the house they'd lived in during the early years of their marriage, the one with the creaky floors and the backyard James always swore he'd build, a treehouse in. It was too big, too full of ghosts. Instead, she moved into a modest 2-bedroom townhouse on the quieter side of town. There was no yard, but there was a window seat in the living room where Maggie would sometimes sit with a cup of tea, staring out at the street as the world kept moving on, surprised that it hadn't stopped entirely when James died. Emily grew, quickly, as children do when you're not looking. She was artistic from a young age, always sketching in notebooks, her fingers smudged with charcoal or pastels. Maggie encouraged her creativity, knowing how much James had loved to draw himself. He used to sketch little comics in the margins of his letters home, stick figures fighting dragons or baking cookies with the words, "Daddy loves you," floating above their heads in speech bubbles. Maggie kept every one of those letters in a shoebox beneath her bed, bound with a ribbon she hadn't untied in years. For all the weight of loss, Maggie never let bitterness root in her. There were hard days, of course. Birthdays, anniversaries, the first time Emily asked her why all the other kids had dads at the school play and she didn't. But Maggie always answered as truthfully and gently as she could. "Your daddy was brave," she'd say. "He loved you more than anything. He was trying to make the world safer for you." She didn't date. Not seriously, anyway. There were a few coffee shop introductions and awkward dinners arranged by well-meaning friends, but her heart never stirred. James had taken it with him, she liked to think, tucked somewhere safe beyond the stars. Instead, she focused on raising Emily, on keeping her husband's memory alive without letting it become a shadow that darkened every room they entered. They hung a photo of him in the hallway, not at the end like some somber memorial, but right in the middle, smiling, alive, his arm slung casually around Maggie's shoulder like he'd never left. 15 years is a long time, but it passes in moments. One day, Emily was 5 and missing her daddy. The next, she was 20, loading art supplies into the trunk of her car, waving goodbye as she drove off to college. Maggie stood on the curb, watching the car disappear down the street, her heart full of pride and that same old ache she'd carried for so long. She was 50 now, the streaks of gray in her hair more noticeable, the lines around her eyes etched a little deeper. But there was strength there too, the quiet kind that builds over time like sediment-forming stone. She still worked at the library, though her hours had lessened. The place felt like a second home now, filled with familiar faces and the soft comfort of stories waiting patiently on the shelves. Her evenings were quiet, some spent with a book, others with a glass of wine and an old record James used to love spinning on their vintage player. She'd kept his collection all these years, stacked neatly in a wooden crate beside the fireplace. When the needle hit the vinyl and that warm, crackling sound filled the room, it was almost like having him back for a moment. Each year on the anniversary of his death, she and Emily would visit the town's war memorial, lay a bouquet of fresh sunflowers, James's favorite, and stand together in silence. They never spoke much during those visits. Words seemed unnecessary. They would just stand there side by side, mother and daughter, two women bound by the memory of the same man. Life had not unfolded the way Maggie once imagined it would when she and James danced barefoot in the kitchen of their first apartment, dreaming out loud about their future. But it had been a life lived with love, with resilience, with purpose. And that, she knew, was something James would have been proud of. Still, she never stopped wondering, not in an obsessive way, but in that quiet, persistent whisper that trails, just behind grief, wondering what really happened in those faraway mountains, wondering if he'd suffered, if he'd been afraid, if he'd thought of her in those final moments. She had asked the army those questions once, and they had replied, with their practiced lines, their practiced sympathy, no clear answers, only the echo of a life interrupted. And so Maggie carried on, her days stitched together with routine and memory, never expecting that the truth she'd buried would one day come knocking, that a message, quietly waiting in the digital ether, would find its way to her inbox and begin unraveling everything she thought she knew about the day her world fell apart. By the time Margaret Ellis turned 53, her life had settled into a rhythm so familiar it could have been written out like sheet music. She rose each morning with the sun, letting the early light fill the small townhouse with a soft golden glow. She would make herself a pot of coffee, strong the way James used to like it, and sip it slowly while standing at the kitchen sink, watching the world begin again outside her window. A boy on a scooter zipped by like clockwork every morning at 7:15. The elderly couple across the street always stepped out to fetch their newspaper hand in hand. Life continued in predictable loops, each day a slightly faded copy of the one before it. The quiet suited her. After years of heartache, Maggie found comfort in the calm. She didn't long for surprises or upheaval. Her soul, once bruised and grieving, had grown tenderly used to solitude. The library remained her second home. Though she had scaled back her hours since Emily left for college, Maggie still spent 3 afternoons a week among the books, the scent of paper and aged ink, a balm for her spirit. She knew the regulars by name, the retired teacher who checked out romance novels by the armful, the shy teenager who hid in the poetry section, the veteran who always asked if they had any new World War II biographies. It was there, in the quiet stacks of the town library, that Maggie found her peace. She liked the way stories waited patiently for someone to need them. She liked the soft murmur of pages turning, the clack of keyboard keys, the rustle of jackets as patrons came and went. She liked the way the world narrowed in that space, letting her forget the jagged edges of her past for just a little while. There was nothing dramatic about her days, and that was just fine with her. Her relationship with Emily had only grown stronger through the years. Though her daughter lived a few hours away now, studying art education at a university near Pittsburgh, they talked every evening. Not always about important things. Sometimes it was just what they had for dinner or how their plants were doing. But those small conversations were threads that kept their bond tightly woven. Maggie had raised her daughter to be independent, but Emily still leaned on her mother when life pressed too hard. That closeness was something Maggie cherished more than anything else. Evenings were Maggie's favorite time of day. After a light dinner, usually something simple, soup, a salad, maybe a grilled cheese sandwich, she would light a candle and pull out a book from the growing stack beside her armchair. Occasionally, she would flip through the old photo albums she kept neatly arranged on a nearby shelf. James's face would smile back at her from birthday parties, beach vacations, Sunday picnics in the park. There was a whole life in those pages, a life that once burned bright with laughter, love, and shared dreams. And though it hurt to look sometimes, Maggie refused to let those memories collect dust. They were too precious, too real. She had never truly opened her heart to another man, not because she thought it was wrong, but because no one else had ever reached into that sacred place where James still lived. Friends had hinted, nudged, even set her up on dates now and then, but Maggie always smiled politely and found a way to step back. She didn't see herself as lonely. She saw herself as full of love that hadn't disappeared, just changed its shape. And yet underneath the tranquility, beneath the routine and the calm, there was still a question Maggie had never been able to bury completely. It lived deep inside her, quiet, but constant. What really happened to James that day? The Army's explanation had always felt unfinished, like a story missing its final chapter. She'd never received a body. Just a folded flag, a stack of documents, and words like presumed dead that echoed hollow in her ears. For 15 years, she had told herself that closure wasn't always clean, that sometimes answers didn't come. But in her heart, that whisper had never fully gone quiet. She didn't talk about it anymore, not even with Emily. What good would it do, dredging up the past that couldn't be changed? And yet on quiet nights she would still find herself staring at the ceiling, wondering if James had been scared, if he'd had time to think of them, if he'd spoken her name as the end came. She tried not to dwell, tried to focus on what she had. But the questions remained, patient and heavy, waiting. On a chilly morning in early October, Maggie sat at her kitchen table, paying bills and sorting through the week's mail. A catalog from a gardening company, a couple of political flyers, and a plain white envelope with no return address. She almost tossed it, assuming it was junk, but something stopped her. She turned it over. Her name was handwritten in a bold, slightly unfamiliar script. Curious, she slid her finger beneath the flap and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, with no heading, no signature. Her eyes scanned the lines quickly, then again more slowly, disbelief curling in, her stomach like smoke. Mrs. Ellis, I don't know how to explain this in a way that makes sense. You don't know me, but I know about your husband. I served with him. What you were told, what everyone was told, it wasn't the full story. He didn't die the way they said. He may not have died at all. Her heart froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The letter slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the floor like a bird struck mid-flight. She stared at it, the words already burned into her memory. After all this time, after all the silence and the tears, and the careful rebuilding, a single piece of paper had come to shatter the fragile piece she had spent 15 years constructing. Outside, the window, the world went on as if nothing had changed. But inside that small townhouse, Margaret Ellis felt the ground beneath her shift. The rhythm of her days, the quiet she had grown to depend on, none of it would be the same now. The past, she had tucked away so carefully, had come knocking again, and this time it wasn't going to wait. The letter sat on the floor like something alive, humming with a silent tension that pulled at every nerve in Margaret Ellis's body. She stared at it from her chair, her hands curled around her mug of now cold coffee, her mind whirring through. 15 years of grief, healing, and slow measured acceptance. She had built her life upon the foundation of a single fact. James had died in Afghanistan. That loss had defined every decision, every turning point, every quiet moment since. But now, with only a few lines typed on a piece of paper, that truth had been cracked wide open. She reached down and picked it up again, her fingers trembling as if the paper might burn her. The words were still there, clear and direct, impossible to misinterpret. Someone out there claimed to know the truth. Someone who said James hadn't died, not in the way the army told her. Maybe not at all. For a long while she couldn't move. Her thoughts spiraled, looping in and out of memories she thought had long since settled into dust. She remembered that day, the knock at the door, the two uniformed men who wouldn't meet her eyes, the carefully chosen phrases delivered with solemn professionalism. Confirmed casualty, combat engagement, body unrecovered due to terrain. She'd asked every question she could think of, but the answers had been vague, the details cloudy. They'd told her not to expect more. The region had been unstable, the area too dangerous to retrieve remains. They'd offered her a flag, a ceremony, and sympathy. She had clung to those as tightly as a drowning woman might clutch a piece of driftwood. And now someone claimed the story was different. The letter gave no name, no contact information, only that anonymous revelation delivered like a bomb with no fuse. It was unsigned, untraceable, and yet it rang with something more powerful than fact. It rang with possibility. Maggie read it again, slowly this time, trying to pick apart the tone, the cadence, the structure. It didn't feel like a prank. It felt real. Real enough to shake her entire foundation. She didn't tell anyone. Not at first. She placed the letter in the drawer beside her bed, the one where she kept James's old letters, and closed it gently, as though sealing it away would stop the thoughts from racing through her head. But they kept coming, unrelenting and fierce. What if it were true? What if he had survived and no one had told her? What if he was still out there? For 3 days, Maggie walked through her life like a ghost. She went to work at the library, smiled at the regulars, reshelved returned books and answered emails, all the while hiding the storm inside her chest. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering James's voice, the feel of his hand in hers, the way he used to whistle while tying his boots. If he were alive, if there was even the smallest chance, she had to know. On the 4th day, she called Emily. Her daughter's voice was cheerful, full of energy and light. "Hey, Mom, I was just thinking about you. Guess what? My sculpture got accepted into the winter showcase." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Maggie replied, her voice softer than usual, her thoughts tangled. "Listen, can I ask you something a little odd?" "Sure," Emily said, the smile still in her voice. "Do you remember how I told you about the details of your dad's death? About the uncertainty, the fact that they never recovered his body?" "Yeah," Emily said, her tone shifting. "Of course I remember. If someone told you there was more to the story, something the army never said, what would you think?" There was a pause on the other end. "I'd want to know everything," Emily said. "Why? Did someone say something?" Maggie hesitated, her thumb rubbing the corner of the letter now resting in her lap. "I got a letter, an anonymous one. It said your father didn't die the way we were told, that he might not have died at all." There was silence, then a quiet, "Oh my God." "I don't know what to believe," Maggie admitted, her voice cracking just slightly. "It could be a mistake or someone playing a cruel joke. But if there's even the tiniest chance, Emily, I need to know." "You have to find out," Emily said, no hesitation. "Even if it's nothing, we have to know." That night, Maggie took the letter out again and placed it on her kitchen table. She stared at it, searching for anything, any detail, any clue that might lead her to the person who sent it. Nothing. It was typed in plain black font on ordinary paper, without even a postmark to give away its origin. But the words, Those impossible words were like a door she couldn't ignore. She turned to the old shoebox under her bed. James's letters had been untouched for years, wrapped in the same faded ribbon she'd used when she packed them away. Slowly, she opened them one by one, her eyes scanning every line, searching for something she might have missed, something hidden, something coded. But all she found were memories. Love notes from a man who had adored his wife and daughter. Sketches of their family, silly jokes, dreams about coming home. Still, a small, stubborn voice whispered, someone else had been there. Someone who had known James, fought beside him, seen things she never had. Whoever wrote that letter might hold the key to everything she never knew. Maggie spent the next few days reaching out, quietly and carefully, to the limited contacts she still had from that time. Old Army wives now scattered across the country, whose husbands had served with James. She sent cautious messages, asking if they had ever heard rumors, strange inconsistencies, anything that didn't quite line up. Most replied kindly, though confused, saying they had always believed what they were told. But one name came back to her again and again, a man named Samuel Green, a medic. Quiet, kept to himself, left the military shortly after James's presumed death. No one had heard from him in years. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time in a long time, Maggie felt purpose flood her veins. The letter had cracked something, open inside her, not just doubt but hope. Wild, dangerous, impossible hope. She didn't know where it would lead, but she knew one thing for certain. She was going to follow it. She had to. Because if James was still out there, she would find him. She owed him that much, and she owed herself the truth. The next morning, as the sun pushed its golden fingers through the blinds and cast gentle rays across the wooden floor of her kitchen, Maggie Ellis sat with her second cup of coffee, her laptop open, the screen glowing faintly in the soft light. The world outside went on as always. The same boy with the scooter zipped by. The mail carrier made his quiet rounds. But inside her home, a storm had begun to gather. She'd spent most of the night turning over the name Samuel Green in her mind, whispering it like a prayer or a riddle, hoping it would unlock something long buried. There had been dozens of soldiers in James's unit, but Samuel had come up repeatedly in those quiet exchanges with the other Army wives. A man who had never quite settled back into civilian life after the war, someone who had disappeared into the folds of time and silence. She typed his name into the search bar and waited, heart racing. At first, the results were scattered and vague. Old articles, unrelated social media profiles, and public records that went nowhere. She added in what she knew. Samuel Green, Army medic, Afghanistan, and the year James was lost, 2008. That narrowed the field. Slowly, painfully, a few details began to surface. A news article from a local paper in Arizona mentioned a decorated medic named Samuel Green who had returned home in 2009. Another report from a veterans support group newsletter from a few years later included a short note about a Samuel Green volunteering in rural Montana, helping at a mobile clinic. No photo, no current address, just hints, fragments, threads waiting to be pulled. Maggie scribbled notes in the margin of a spiral-bound notebook, a habit she'd never lost from her schoolgirl days. She circled locations, drew arrows between names, tried to make sense of a trail that was more ghost than man. By mid-afternoon, her coffee had gone cold again, and her mind buzzed with exhaustion, but she had something, an address, a post office, box in a small town near Helena, Montana, listed as a contact for the clinic. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had yesterday. She stared at it, her finger hovering above the trackpad. This was the moment. She could close the lid, tell herself it was all nonsense, that some ghost from the past had stirred the dust for no reason, and return to her quiet life of order and peace. But she knew better now. That letter had cracked something open in her, and it wouldn't be closed again. Not until she had the truth, not until she could breathe without that weight of not knowing pressing against her ribs. With a steadying breath, she composed a short email, carefully worded, every sentence shaped with both caution and urgency. She introduced herself, explained. Her connection to James mentioned the letter without giving away too much. Then she added the line that mattered most. If you are the same Samuel Green who served with my husband, please, I need to talk to you. Any information you can share would mean the world to me. She hesitated only briefly before pressing send. The hours that followed moved slowly. Every sound made her flinch, the ding of a new email, the creak of a floorboard, the passing hum of a car. She told herself not to expect a reply right away. This man had disappeared for a reason. If he was hiding from something, he wouldn't rush to reappear. And yet, late that evening, just as she was folding laundry in the quiet hum of the dryer, her phone buzzed. The message was brief. Maggie, this is Sam Green. I got your note. We should talk. Soon. She sat down on the edge of her bed, her legs suddenly weak. Her eyes scanned the screen again and again. It was real. He existed. He had replied. She quickly typed back, suggesting a time to call. He responded, with a phone number, and simply wrote, tomorrow. Noon. The next morning, Maggie's hands trembled as she dialed the number. Her heart pounded in her chest, the receiver pressed tightly to her ear. It rang once. Twice. Then a voice, rough, deep, aged by something more than time. This is Sam. She swallowed hard. Mr. Green. It's Maggie Ellis, James's wife. There was a silence that stretched between them, heavy and full. Then he exhaled. I figured you'd call eventually. I was wondering when someone would. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He sighed. I mean, I should have said something a long time ago. But I was scared. We all were. What we saw, what we were told to forget, it never sat right with me. She leaned forward, gripping the phone tighter. Please, Sam, tell me. Was James alive? Is he alive now? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice cracked. I don't know for sure. But I saw things that didn't make sense. The day they said James died, I saw him get taken, not killed, taken, by someone we weren't supposed to know about. No insignias, no flags, just black gear, clean trucks, and orders from people higher than anyone in our unit. Maggie felt her world tilt beneath her. Taken, why? Who were they? I don't know, he said, but I know what I saw. And I know we were warned. Told not to talk, told it was a training accident. But that wasn't what happened. James didn't die in any firefight. He was taken, alive, and then he disappeared. She covered her mouth, tears rising fast. Why now, Sam? Why send the letter now? Because I couldn't live with it anymore, he said, voice low. I've seen what silence does to a man. And I thought maybe if you knew, you could find him. Or at least know the truth. I don't have answers, but I have places. Names. Leads. If you want them. She nodded, though he couldn't see. Yes, she said fiercely. I want them. I want all of it. He agreed to send what he had, a file, old notes, coordinates, names scratched into notebooks he hadn't touched in years. As she hung up the phone, Maggie felt something she hadn't in over a decade. Not just hope, not just fear, but direction. She was no longer standing in the fog. The path was unclear, but it was there. And for the first time since that knock on her door 15 years ago, she was going to follow it. The manila envelope arrived 3 days later, thick and weathered, as if it had made its way across the country by foot rather than mail. Maggie stared at it lying on her porch like a coiled secret, her fingers hesitant to pick it up. The return address was handwritten. No name, just the Helena, Montana post office box. She brought it inside carefully, like it might fall apart if handled too roughly, and set it on her kitchen table, the same place where she had first read the letter that had shattered the story she had believed for 15 years. For a long moment, she just stood over it, the silence in the room pressing in around her. Then she opened it. Inside were pages, dozens of them, Some typed, others scrawled in shaky penmanship. A few speckled with coffee stains or what looked suspiciously like old blood. There were maps, too, the kind printed from online satellite images, with hand-drawn circles and arrows and notes in the margins. Maggie sat down slowly and spread them out like puzzle pieces, one after the other, her eyes scanning every word, her heart clenching with each name and detail. Some of it was hard to decipher, but what emerged was a pattern, fragmented and obscured, but real. Sam had written everything he remembered: the night of the ambush, the radio silence, the unmarked vehicles, the way their commanding officer changed after that day, tight-lipped and unnaturally calm. He described how James had been separated from the others, how two soldiers in black gear had hauled him into a transport and vanished into the hills. Sam had tried to follow, had questioned the reports later but was met with stern warnings and veiled threats. Eventually, he'd stopped asking, or at least, stopped asking out loud. But what truly shook Maggie was the note attached to one of the maps. It was written in a different hand, smaller, precise. It read, J.E. seen at forward site Bravo, March 2009. Transferred under Black Protocol, unknown destination. Those 3 letters, J.E. James Ellis. It couldn't be coincidence. Sam had circled the note and drawn an arrow to the words, Classified Recovery Program, and added, Find Dr. Lionel Creighton. Last known at VA office in Richmond, VA. Maggie's fingers traced the ink like it might speak the truth out loud. Richmond. That was something. A place. A man. A name. She took a deep breath and reached for her phone, her fingers moving faster, now, driven by something beyond curiosity. She searched for Dr. Lionel Creighton and found a profile, retired psychiatrist, once contracted by the Department of Defense, now volunteering at a veterans center. He wasn't completely hidden, but he wasn't broadcasting his past either. She dialed the number listed for the center, her hand shaking slightly, and asked if he still worked there. The voice on the other end confirmed he came in twice a week. She left a message, trying to sound calm but knowing she failed. My name is Maggie Ellis. My husband served in Afghanistan in 2008. I believe you may have information that could help me. Please call me back. She waited for 2 days, during which her nerves wore thin like old paper. Every phone. Buzz startled her. Every knock at the door made her jump. But on the morning of the 3rd day, her phone rang with a Virginia area code. Mrs. Ellis? The voice was measured, professional, but not cold. This is Dr. Creighton. I received your message. Thank you for calling me back, she said, almost breathless. I know this may sound strange, but I've come across some information about my husband, James Ellis. He was declared killed in action in 2008, but someone believes he may not have died. There was a pause. I'm familiar with that name, Creighton said quietly. But I need to be very clear. The things you're asking about, they're not part of the official record. They're buried for a reason. But they're real? Maggie asked, her heart pounding. He exhaled, long and slow. I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you this. Your husband was part of something unusual. After the ambush, a small number of soldiers were taken into a specialized program, voluntarily. Or not, I was never told. They were deemed psychologically resilient, useful. What happened to them after that? I was never given clearance, but I saw the early evaluations. James Ellis was among them. Maggie's knees nearly gave out and she sank into a chair. Why? What kind of program? There were rumors, he said carefully. Psychological operations, deep cover assignments, experiments. Some thought it was brainwashing. Others said it was a rehabilitation protocol for broken soldiers. I don't know what to believe. I left the program because I didn't like what I saw. Too many missing records. Too many orders without names. Do you know where they took him? She whispered. No, he replied almost sadly. But I know someone who might. A man named Charles Monroe. He was the logistics coordinator for site movements. Disappeared around 2012. Last I heard, he was living off-grid in Oregon. If you find him, be careful. He won't be easy to convince, but he may be the only one who knows where your husband ended up." After the call ended, Maggie sat in silence for a long time, the phone still pressed to her ear. Every word had cracked the past open wider. She felt the weight of it all pressing down, but also something else: momentum. She was no longer just chasing shadows. There were names, trails, places, people who knew something. People who had touched the same world her husband had been swallowed by. She went back to the envelope and sifted through Sam's notes again. In the corner of one page, she noticed a faint scribble she hadn't seen before. It was a fragment of a sentence. "He looked right at me. He knew I saw, but he didn't speak. Just nodded. Like it was goodbye." Her throat tightened. That image, James bruised but alive, captured but composed, haunted her. She folded the papers carefully and slid them back into the envelope. She wasn't sure what would come next, only that she would follow this trail no matter how faint, no matter how far. James was out there. Somewhere between the lines of classified documents and whispered memories, between the long years and the hollow grief, he had left a trace. And Maggie was going to find it. The road curled into the mountains like a ribbon laid loose by some careless hand, its edges lined with towering pines and the faint scent of moss and damp bark. Maggie's hands gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale against the dark leather, the tires of her rented SUV humming softly over the uneven pavement. The world had narrowed to that stretch of road, to the trees that seemed to lean in like sentinels, guarding the secrets ahead. Oregon's wilderness was vast and hushed, untouched in a way that made time feel irrelevant. She had driven nearly 2,000 miles to get here, chasing the faint trail left by Charles Monroe, the man who had once shuffled soldiers like chess, pieces and vanished before anyone could question why. She hadn't told anyone she was going. Not Beth, not her neighbor Helen, not even Sam Green, who had been reluctant to share Monroe's last known location at all. But Maggie's resolve had only sharpened. She hadn't come this far to stop at the edge of truth. With Dr. Creighton's words echoing in her head, "Be careful," she had followed the breadcrumbs to a place called Clover Ridge, a forgotten dot on the map with no cell service and only one general store. It was there, after a few cautious conversations and a well-placed photo of Monroe from an old Army newsletter, that a grizzled man behind the counter said, "You looking for the fella who lives off the North Fork Trail? Keeps to himself. Got eyes like he's seen too much." Maggie had nodded, heart thudding, and now here she was bumping down a narrow dirt path barely wide enough for her car, branches scraping the windows like warning fingers. The cabin came into view slowly, tucked into a clearing near the edge of a cold, rocky creek. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a mutt of a dog lifted its head from the porch, watching her approach with unblinking eyes. She parked a few feet away and stepped out slowly, her boots crunching on the gravel. Every instinct screamed that she was standing on a threshold, not just of space but of truth. The front door opened before she could knock. A man stepped out, tall, lean, his gray-streaked beard tangled and sun-bleached. His eyes locked onto hers instantly, sharp, suspicious but not unkind. "You lost?" he asked, voice deep and weathered. "No," Maggie said quietly. "I think I finally found something." He didn't respond, just studied her, as though measuring whether she was real. She held up a photograph, James in uniform, smiling, young, full of life. "You knew him," she said. "James Ellis. You moved him. You know where he went." Something flickered in Monroe's expression. Pain, memory, maybe guilt. He didn't deny it. Instead, he stepped aside. "Come in," he said, and she followed, the door creaking shut behind them. Inside, the cabin was simple but warm. Stacked wood near the fireplace, a battered table, maps tacked to the walls like ghosts of another life. Monroe poured coffee into 2 tin mugs and sat across from her. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then he leaned back, sighing. "I was told to forget James Ellis," he said. "Told to erase him from every manifest, every log. But I didn't. I couldn't. Where did they take him? Maggie's voice trembled with barely restrained emotion. Was he alive? He nodded slowly. Yes, he was. They brought him to Site Echo, a black facility in the Bitterroot Range. No records, no oversight. Just names on a list and a chain of silence. They said he volunteered, but I saw the reports. Psychological reconditioning, memory isolation. It wasn't treatment. It was containment. Maggie's stomach turned. Why? What did they think he knew? Monroe shook his head. Not what he knew. What he was capable of. They believed certain soldiers showed traits: resilience under trauma, high empathy, strong moral cores. They wanted to see if those traits could be harnessed, even controlled. James resisted. I remember the incident reports. He refused commands, questioned protocols, and then one day, he was transferred. To where? I don't know, Monroe said, regret shadowing his features. They moved him in the dead of night, no records, but before he left, he gave me something. Said if I ever met someone who came looking for the truth, I should pass it on. Rose and disappeared into the back room, returning a moment later with a sealed envelope. Maggie took it with reverent hands, her fingers trembling. Inside was a single page. A letter. In James's handwriting. Maggie, if you ever see this, it means you never stopped believing in me. I can't say where I am, only that I'm not the man you remember. They've done things to me, but I hold on to you, to us. It's the only thing they couldn't take. I'll find a way back. I promise. Don't give up. Tears streamed down Maggie's face. Her heart ached with both hope and anguish. He was alive. He had been alive. And somewhere out there, maybe he still was. I tried to find out more, Monroe said quietly, but the trail went cold. You'd need access to military clearance beyond anything I ever had. Maggie folded the letter carefully, like it was something holy. Then I'll find someone who does. Monroe looked at her, something like admiration in his eyes. You're braver than most, he said. They built those walls thick. But if anyone can break through, it's someone who still believes love is stronger than fear. She left the cabin as the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows that danced across the clearing. The air was sharp and alive, and so was she. With the letter clutched to her chest and a fire lit deep within her, Maggie knew this was no longer just a search. It was a rescue, and she was going to finish what James had started. The letter from James weighed heavily in Maggie's pocket as she made her way back down the winding mountain road, the setting sun painting the sky with hues of amber and rose. The world around her seemed to hold its breath, as if it too sensed the fragile thread of hope she was clutching. Her mind was a whirlwind, filled with questions and the faintest glimmer of answers. But it was the old, familiar ache deep in her heart that pushed her forward. It was that ache, a mother's intuition that refused to let go, that whispered there was more beneath the surface, more to uncover, more to fight for. Maggie's life had never been about waiting passively for miracles. For years after James's death, she had buried her grief beneath a veneer of quiet strength. She had raised their son Daniel on her own, navigating the long, lonely nights and the holidays that felt hollow without his father. But Daniel was no longer a child, and Maggie's resolve had shifted from survival to discovery. She had to find out the truth, not just for herself, but for him. He deserved to know the man his father had been, and the man he might still be. Back in her modest home in Vermont, Maggie spread out all the pieces she had gathered so far: the letter, Sam's notes, the photographs, and now Monroe's confession. It was a tangled web, a conspiracy of silence and shadows, but her mother's instinct told her there was a pattern if only she could see it clearly. She traced her fingers over the old maps, the annotations pointing to secret sites, and felt the weight of 1,000 untold stories pressing down on her. Somewhere in those lines and smudges lay the path to James, but it wasn't just the documents that fueled her search. It was something deeper, something intangible. Maggie remembered the way James had looked at her the last time they spoke before. Deployment, a mix of hope, fear, and unspoken promises. He had been a man torn between duty and family, carrying burdens he never voiced. Her heart ached with the realization that she had never truly known all of him. There were parts of James still hidden, even to those who loved him most. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was Daniel. His voice was calm, but concerned. "Mom, I found something. Old emails from Dad's account. They've been archived. But there's a folder labeled Echo. It's encrypted, but I'm working on it." Maggie's pulse quickened. This was the break she needed. Together, they spent late nights poring over fragments of digital correspondence, messages from anonymous senders, cryptic references to Project Echo, and coordinates that matched those on Monroe's maps. Daniel's tech skills unlocked pieces of a puzzle that had been buried deep within the military's classified archives. Every decoded file revealed more about James's secret mission, his resistance to the program, and a hidden network of soldiers who had been silenced. As days turned into weeks, Maggie felt the loneliness of her quest lessen. She wasn't alone anymore. Daniel was by her side, a partner in the search, and even Sam Green's occasional phone calls offered support. Each new lead brought her closer, but also deeper into a maze of lies and cover-ups that spanned the highest ranks of the military. The more she uncovered, the more dangerous it seemed. One evening, as she sat by the fireplace reading through a recovered journal entry written in James's hand, Maggie's instincts flared with a sudden urgency. The entry spoke of a rendezvous, a chance to escape the program's grasp, a plan to disappear and protect those he loved. James had risked everything to send a message, to leave a trail, hoping someone would find it. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. The message had found her. Her mother's intuition was no longer just a whisper, it was a roar. She had to trust it. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with peril, but she was ready. For James, for Daniel, for the truth that could finally set them free. With renewed determination, Maggie packed a small bag, her heart steady despite the storm of emotions inside. She was heading south, toward the next clue, toward a truth that would either break her or make her whole. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in 15 years, hope was not just a distant dream. It was alive, burning bright in the night. The days that followed were a whirlwind of whispered conversations, locked files, and clandestine meetings. Maggie felt as though she had stepped into a shadow world, where every piece of information came with a price, and every truth hid a deeper secret. The decrypted emails and James's journal entries pointed her to a small town in Northern California, Redwood Falls, where an old military base had been repurposed but still held echoes of its dark past. According to the records, Project Echo's remnants were buried there, along with files that could explain everything about James's disappearance and the strange experiments Monroe had alluded to. With Daniel now fully involved, her son's youthful energy and technical savvy breathed new life into the investigation, pushing Maggie to face what she had long feared, that James's death had never been natural, and the truth might shatter everything she believed about the man she loved. Their first step was a visit to the local library, where archives of military contracts and news clippings from decades ago hinted at the secrecy surrounding the base. An elderly librarian named Mrs. Jenkins, who had lived in Redwood Falls all her life, was more helpful than they expected. She recalled seeing soldiers arrive and leave in unusual patterns, and whispered about black ops and experimental programs the townsfolk barely understood. As she shared her memories, Maggie felt a chill settle over her. The fragments of the past were coming together, painting a picture far darker than any story she had heard. It was as if James had been caught in a web not just of war, but of covert manipulation and betrayal. The next day, with Daniel's help, Maggie managed to gain access to a government archive located on the outskirts of town. It was heavily guarded, with security cameras and motion sensors, but the files they sought were encrypted in layers of firewalls and passwords. Hours turned into days as Daniel worked tirelessly, his fingers flying over the keyboard, breaking, through defenses designed to keep prying eyes away. Finally, when the last barrier fell, They uncovered a trove of documents, medical reports, psychological evaluations, and confidential memos that referenced James's name repeatedly. The reports described enhanced cognitive conditioning, emotional suppression, and controlled memory reconstruction. It was horrifying. James had been subjected to experimental treatments that stripped away his identity piece by piece, designed to make him into a weapon rather than a man. Maggie's hands trembled as she read, but her resolve hardened. This was why James had resisted. This was why Monroe had warned her to be careful. It was more than a cover-up. It was a war on the human soul itself. She thought of the letter he had given Monroe, the promise that he would find a way back, that their love was a beacon in the darkness. Now she understood how heavy that promise was. One night, as Maggie pieced together a timeline of James's movements and transfers, a knock at her door startled her. It was Sam Green, his expression grave but determined. "They're watching you," he said quietly. "I've been keeping tabs since you reached out. You're stirring up things that some people want buried forever." Fear curled in Maggie's stomach, but she refused to let it freeze her. "What do I do now?" she asked. "Keep digging. But be smart. They have eyes everywhere, and they won't hesitate to silence anyone who gets too close." His warning was clear, but so was his faith in her. Sam's presence was a reminder that she was not alone in this fight. The following weeks brought a cascade of revelations. They discovered that Project Echo wasn't isolated to just one base. It was part of a nationwide program aimed at turning soldiers into emotionless operatives, stripping away their pasts and reshaping them into perfect agents. James had been a key target because of his unwavering moral compass, which they saw as a threat to their control. But the documents also hinted at a resistance, a secret group within the military that sought to expose the program and rescue those trapped inside. Fueled by these discoveries, Maggie and Daniel reached out to a former military intelligence officer named Laura Price, who had once worked covertly to protect soldiers from abuse. Laura's network had access to whistleblowers and insiders who had escaped the program's grip. With her help, Maggie learned that James had made contact with this underground resistance before he disappeared, trying to find a way out for himself and others. This knowledge was a lifeline, proof that James was not defeated, that part of him had fought back until the very end. As the puzzle pieces fell into place, Maggie's heart swelled with a mix of sorrow and hope. The man she loved had been lost to a battle far bigger than the war they had all expected, but his spirit lived on in every secret uncovered and every step closer they took to the truth. The past was unraveling, and with it, the possibility of a future where justice could finally be served. The road ahead was still dangerous and uncertain, but Maggie's determination burned brighter than ever. She was no longer just a widow chasing memories. She was a warrior armed with knowledge, driven by a mother's love and a wife's promise. The secrets that had been hidden for so long were beginning to break free, and Maggie knew that the moment of reckoning was drawing near. The truth was coming out of the shadows, and with it, a chance to heal the wounds that had haunted her family for too long. The night was still and quiet when Maggie sat alone in her living room, the soft glow of a lamp casting long shadows across the worn pages of James's journal. Each word was a whisper from the past, carrying the weight of secrets long buried, but never forgotten. Her eyes traced the familiar handwriting, a mixture of hope and despair etched into every line. The truth had been elusive, but now it was closer than ever. Yet just as the pieces were coming together, the unexpected happened. A message arrived, one that shattered the fragile calm she had managed to build. It was a letter, slipped under her front door without a sound. No return address, no indication of who had sent it. The envelope was old-fashioned, the paper thick and cream-colored, the handwriting elegant but hurried. Maggie's fingers trembled as she unfolded the letter, the words blurring at first through, tears she hadn't realized were falling. The letter began simply, but what followed turned her world upside down. It was from James, or so it claimed, written long ago, but sent now by someone who had guarded it until the right moment. Maggie, if you are reading this, it means my plan has been set in motion. I am alive. But they keep me hidden, controlled, a prisoner of their own fears and lies. I never stop thinking of you, of Daniel, and of the life we dreamed of. I have found a way to reach you through this message, a link to what remains of my past and a guide to my future. You must believe me. You must keep searching. I am closer than you think. Maggie's breath hitched. The letter held a code, a series of numbers and symbols tucked into the margins, something only someone who knew James could understand. She immediately called Daniel, her voice urgent but steady. I found something, a message from Dad, hidden in the letter. It's a code, and it looks like coordinates. Together they pored over the cryptic symbols, piecing them together with the help of Laura Price, the former intelligence officer who had become their ally. The coordinates pointed to a remote location in the Cascade Mountains, a place James had referenced in his journal but never named explicitly. Without hesitation, Maggie knew where she had to go next. It was a dangerous gamble, but the chance to finally find James was worth every risk. She packed her bags, the letter safely tucked, in her jacket pocket, and set out on the journey with Daniel by her side. The mountains were vast and wild, the air crisp and filled with the scent of pine and earth. Every mile brought them closer to the truth, and closer to a past that refused to stay buried. As they trekked through rugged terrain, Maggie's mind was a storm of memories and hope. She remembered the man James had been, the gentle, loving husband who had held her hand through the darkest times, and the man he had become, a fighter trapped in a secret war within himself. The thought that he was alive, somewhere in the wilderness or hidden behind locked doors, gave her strength she didn't know she had. It was a mother's love, a wife's devotion, driving her forward against all odds. Reaching the coordinates, they found an abandoned outpost, overgrown and silent except for the whisper of the wind through broken windows. It looked deserted, but Maggie's heart told her otherwise. Inside, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, was a small box. It contained a worn photograph of James and a flash drive. With trembling hands, Daniel plugged the drive into his laptop and a video began to play. A message from James himself, recorded in secret, filled with hope and a plea for patience. I am working to come home, he said, his voice steady, despite the shadows behind him. Hold on for me. We will be together again. Tears streamed down Maggie's face, a mixture of relief and renewed determination. The message was proof. James was still fighting, still reaching out from the darkness. The past had sent a clear sign, and Maggie knew this was the moment everything could change. The journey was far from over, but the message from the past was a beacon lighting the way forward. The discovery of James's video message was a turning point, yet it only deepened the shadows that surrounded Maggie's search. She knew she could not face the growing threats alone, especially now that powerful forces were working to keep the truth buried. That's when Laura Price stepped forward with a proposition, one that was as risky as it was necessary. A dangerous alliance with former insiders, men and women who had once been part of the system but had grown disillusioned, ready to expose the lies and fight for justice. Maggie had no choice but to trust them, even if it meant walking into the lion's den. Laura introduced Maggie to Marcus Reed, a former military intelligence officer with a reputation for being both ruthless and brilliant. Marcus had spent years fighting the very programs that had taken James, and he saw in Maggie a kindred spirit, someone who was not just chasing ghosts, but demanding accountability. His network included whistleblowers, hackers, and activists, all united by a shared mission to bring Project Echo's secrets to light. Maggie's heart pounded as she listened to Marcus outline a plan that could free James and countless others. But it was dangerous, with stakes that could cost them everything. The alliance meant infiltrating classified systems, exposing corrupt officials, and gathering irrefutable evidence. The risks were immense, surveillance was tight, and the military's reach extended far beyond what Maggie had imagined. But the alternative was silence, another generation lost to lies. With Daniel's technical skills and Laura's insider knowledge, Maggie found herself in the midst of a covert operation that blurred the lines between justice and survival. Every move they made was a step closer to the truth, and a step deeper into peril. One evening, while reviewing stolen files in a safe house, Maggie's phone buzzed with a warning. "They're on to you." Marcus's voice was grim when he appeared in the doorway. "We have a mole. Someone's feeding information back to the program's overseers." The tension was suffocating. Trust became a fragile currency as Maggie realized the enemy was closer than she thought. The people who had promised help might also be pawns in a larger game. Paranoia gnawed at her, but she forced herself to focus, to push forward despite the danger. As they dug deeper, a pattern emerged. A list of names connected to the program, including high-ranking officials and contractors who had profited from the secrecy and suffering. Maggie felt her anger rise. This was no longer just about James, it was about exposing a system built on exploitation and betrayal. The alliance grew stronger, bonded by shared outrage and a desire for redemption. Maggie found unexpected comfort in their determination, a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope could be found in unity. Yet the alliance came at a personal cost. Late one night as Maggie returned to her motel, she noticed a shadow lurking nearby. Her pulse quickened, but she held her ground. The figure revealed itself, a former soldier named Ethan, someone who had once worked under the program and had now turned whistleblower. Ethan's testimony was chilling, filled with accounts of broken lives and erased identities. His courage inspired Maggie, but also deepened her fear. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous their mission became. In the days that followed, Maggie's world shrank to a narrow focus: stay alive, protect Daniel, and keep fighting. The alliance had opened doors to information she never dreamed of accessing, but it also painted a target on her back. Each revelation was a double-edged sword, cutting through lies but exposing her to greater threats. Still, she refused to back down. The promise James had made, the love that had sustained her all these years, was her armor against the darkness. The dangerous alliance was more than a strategy. It was a testament to human resilience. Together, they were a force challenging a system built on silence and fear. Maggie's journey had taken her from grief to determination, from isolation to solidarity. And though the path ahead was fraught with danger, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was no longer just for James, it was for all those who had been lost and forgotten. The truth was within reach, and Maggie was ready to claim it no matter the cost. The wind howled through the pines as Maggie stood on the edge of the ridge, her eyes scanning the horizon for signs of movement. The sky above her had turned the color of steel, and in that charged air, she felt it, the sense that something was about to change. She had walked a long, punishing road to reach this moment. Every step had been marked by sacrifice, secrets, and danger. But now, with the alliance holding strong and the truth drawing nearer, the tide was beginning to shift. This, she knew deep in her bones, was the turning point. And once it began, there would be no turning back. Back at the safe house, Marcus laid out the final phase of the plan. "We have one shot," he said, his voice low and steady. "There's a facility outside Fort Randall, off the books, buried beneath layers of fake construction permits and ghost contracts. That's where they're keeping him. That's where we go." A hushed silence followed, heavy with the weight of what they were about to attempt. The facility was guarded by military contractors, surrounded by surveillance drones, and protected by digital firewalls. But they had something the enemy didn't: proof, evidence, and the will to expose everything. Laura had secured access codes from an old contact, and Ethan, the ex-soldier, had drawn the layout from memory. Daniel had created a software worm to disable the cameras for exactly 15 minutes. That was all they would get. 15 minutes to break in, locate James, and extract him before the system reset. Maggie listened with both dread and hope swirling inside her. The risks were towering, but she had come too far to stop now. She was ready to face whatever came, and for the first time she didn't feel alone. The night of the mission arrived cloaked in silence. The team moved like shadows through the underbrush, every step calculated and quiet. As they approached the facility, the sheer scale of it took Maggie's breath away. Steel fences, infrared lights, security towers looming against the night sky. But her eyes stayed fixed on the target. This was the place where James had been taken, where he had lived in the margins of the world for 15 years. Her hands shook, but she kept them steady, her fingers brushing the letter he had sent. The last message from a man who had never stopped loving her. The moment the worm was activated, time seemed to contract. They scaled the fence, bypassed 2 layers of guards, and made their way through the service entrance. Inside, the sterile corridors glowed with an artificial light that seemed to hum with secrets. Maggie's heart pounded as they passed rows of locked doors, each marked with anonymous codes. Finally, they reached the holding section. Marcus signaled, and Laura opened the secured chamber. There, slumped against the wall in a dim cell, was James. He looked older, thinner, and the weight of the years had drawn deep lines into his face. But the moment his eyes met Maggie's, the years melted away. Recognition sparked, and something fierce and alive lit up in his gaze. "Maggie?" His voice was raw, barely more than a whisper. She ran to him, her hands on his face, tears spilling freely. "It's me, James. I'm here. We're getting you out." For a moment the world stood still. Then chaos erupted. An alarm blared. A silent tripwire, something they hadn't anticipated. Guards swarmed the corridor, and the team had to fight their way out, dragging James between them. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, and Maggie felt the burn of fear in her throat. But they moved with purpose, covering one another, each of them driven by something deeper than fear. They made it to the outer fence just as the drone lights blinked back on. Daniel had the van waiting, and they sped off into the darkness, hearts pounding, adrenaline roaring through their veins. Back at the safe house, James sat in stunned silence, his hands gripping Maggie's. She barely let go, afraid that if she did, he might disappear again. He began to speak slowly at first, the words catching in his throat. "They told me no one was looking. They said the world had forgotten." Maggie shook her head, voice fierce with emotion. "I never stopped. I never gave up, and now you're free." James looked at Daniel, then at the faces of the people who had risked everything to find him. His eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," he said, and in that moment, something shifted. The darkness began to lift. The escape had come at a cost. They were now fugitives, hunted by the very government they had once trusted. But the turning point had come and passed, and they were no longer victims of silence. They had the evidence, the testimony, and now, the living proof that James had survived. The road ahead would be hard, but Maggie didn't feel afraid. She had her family, her purpose, and a truth that refused to be buried. The tide had turned. And for the first time in 15 years, Maggie allowed herself to believe in something beautiful. Hope. The days that followed James's rescue were a blur of movement and guarded whispers, the kind of stillness before a storm that carries weight in its silence. Maggie could feel the truth pressing in around them like a dam about to break. She had held on to hope for so long, chased answers through heartbreak and danger, and now the final step lay ahead, revealing everything they had discovered to the world. No more hiding in shadows, no more letting those in power erase the lives they had destroyed. James was alive, and his voice, along with the voices of others like him, was about to echo across the country, undeniable and clear. James was still adjusting to the light, to freedom, to the idea that he could once again make choices. The years had worn him down physically, but his mind was still sharp, and his memories, though scarred, remained intact. Every day he recounted pieces of his imprisonment to Daniel and Laura, details that matched the files they had stolen, details that corroborated the stories from other whistleblowers. Maggie sat beside him through every session, holding his hand, listening, wincing when his voice trembled but never looking away. She had waited too long for this moment to flinch now. Laura reached out to a journalist named Kyle Mercer, a seasoned, investigative reporter known for exposing military cover-ups. He agreed to meet in secret, a rented cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains chosen for its isolation and security. When Kyle arrived and saw James in the flesh, his face paled. This is impossible," he whispered, then glanced toward Maggie. "They held him for 15 years?" Maggie nodded, her voice steady. "And we have everything. The proof, the names, the evidence. We just need someone to help us tell it the right way." Kyle didn't hesitate. "Then we tell it. Every word." The process of preparing the story was painstaking. Kyle recorded hours of footage, James's testimony, documents pulled from encrypted drives, files showing budgets funneled into black, projects, names of contractors and generals who had signed off on human experimentation in the name of psychological warfare and covert operations. As Kyle reviewed the footage, his disbelief turned into fury. He'd covered war, corruption, and betrayal. But this was something deeper. This was sanctioned erasure. "This story's going to make history," he told Maggie one night, staring at his laptop screen. "But you need to be ready. They won't let this come out without a fight." Sure enough, the pressure came quickly. A federal agent paid a quiet visit to Kyle's editor with a sealed envelope and a veiled threat. The platform Kyle had used for years suddenly began pulling unrelated articles, citing vague compliance issues. Laura's bank accounts were flagged. Ethan's house was ransacked by unidentified men who left without taking anything, a warning. But instead of retreating, they pushed harder. Maggie knew now that silence was the enemy, and they would not be silenced again. When Kyle's editor refused to publish, he took the story to a public interest news collective known for releasing government leaks. They accepted within hours. On the night of the release, Maggie couldn't sleep. She sat beside James, watching his chest rise and fall, still afraid it might all vanish like a dream. Daniel sat nearby, laptop glowing in his lap, watching the countdown timer tick down. At exactly 8 p.m., the story went live. Videos, documents, testimonies, and names. Within minutes, social media lit up. Hashtags spread. Former military families began sharing their own stories. Letters that stopped coming. Missions that were never explained. Loved ones who vanished without answers. James's face became a symbol of truth reclaimed. Cable news tried to bury it, but the internet refused to look away. Thousands watched the footage of James talking about his captivity, his training, the isolation, the reprogramming. They saw the video he had left for Maggie, his voice broken but filled with love. People cried. People raged. People demanded answers. Lawmakers called emergency hearings. Protesters gathered outside government buildings. The country was no longer asleep. The truth had come out, and it had cracked the silence wide open. Maggie watched it all unfold with a surreal mix of pride and sorrow. She never wanted to become a public figure, but now, her name was on every screen, her face beside James's in every headline. Some called her a hero, others called her a liar. But she didn't care. She had her husband back. She had her son, safe. And she had exposed a system that had tried to erase them both. Every insult thrown at her, every threat made, only strengthened her resolve. Let them try. The truth had weight now, and it couldn't be buried again. In a small interview, on national television, Maggie sat beside James as they answered questions from a shaken world. "What would you say to the people who did this to you?" the host asked. James looked into the camera, his expression calm but firm. "You stole my life, but you didn't take my soul. You tried to erase me, but you couldn't erase love, and you will not erase the truth." Maggie squeezed his hand, eyes shimmering. And across the country, in living rooms and bedrooms and nursing homes, people wept for them, not just for what was lost, but for what had been found again. The morning after the storm of revelation, the world felt both strange and beautiful. Maggie stood on the porch of the mountain cabin where they had been hiding, watching the mist roll gently across the treetops, every breath of air feeling like a prayer answered. The truth was out now. The lies had been shattered. Her husband was beside her, alive, his hand wrapped warmly around hers. For the first time in 15 years, she didn't wake to an aching emptiness but to the sound of James's breathing, to the quiet murmur of a family reuniting after being broken apart by forces they never should have had to fight. James stepped outside with her, holding 2 mugs of coffee, the kind of everyday gesture that once would have felt insignificant but now meant everything. "Can you believe it?" he said, his voice soft, still a little hoarse from everything he'd said. "In the interviews." Maggie looked at him. Really looked at him. His eyes tired but bright, his body frail but recovering, his soul undiminished. "Some days, no," she admitted. "But today I believe anything's possible." And she meant it. After years of being told to move on after being called a widow when her heart never believed it, she finally had her husband back. The fallout across the country had been massive. Congressional hearings had been announced within 48 hours of the story breaking. Retired generals were subpoenaed. Intelligence agencies scrambled to contain the damage, but the evidence had been overwhelming and public. There was no more hiding. Veterans who had once felt abandoned came forward in droves, sharing similar stories of trauma, secrecy, and unacknowledged missions. It was as if a giant mirror had been held up to the country's conscience. And for once, people refused to look away. Maggie watched it all unfold with awe. She hadn't set out to change the world, but somehow, in her search for James, she had helped it begin to heal. For Daniel, the change was quiet, but profound. The boy who had grown up, haunted by a father-shaped hole, was now walking beside the man himself, learning from him, talking with him late into the night, asking questions he had carried since he was old enough to understand loss. James was patient, careful never to rush, never to act like the years hadn't happened. He listened, just as much as he spoke. And Daniel, once skeptical and sharp-edged, began to soften. One evening as they sat on the porch, Daniel said, "I thought I'd never get the chance to know you." James looked at him and replied, "Then let's make the most of every moment we have." And they did. Laura and Ethan returned to their own lives but stayed in close contact. They had become more than allies. They were family now. The bond forged in the fires of danger was not easily broken. Laura, ever practical, worked with advocacy groups to push for permanent protections for whistleblowers. Ethan began mentoring veterans, helping them navigate the system he once served. And Kyle Mercer's story won a National Journalism Award. Not that he cared much about the recognition. What mattered to him was that the truth had been told, and the people had listened. In time, Maggie and James moved back to their home, a place that had once been filled with silence, but now echoed with laughter and conversation. James spent afternoons in the garden, a small thing he had always dreamed of doing but never had the time for. Maggie joined him, pulling weeds, planting flowers, occasionally stopping just to watch him in the sunlight. There were moments when the pain still surfaced, flashbacks for James, nights when Maggie would wake in fear, but they faced them together, hand in hand. Healing wasn't a straight line, but it was a journey they were finally taking side by side. Neighbors who had once pitied Maggie now welcomed James with open arms, offering smiles, casseroles, and apologies. People had seen the news, had read the story, and suddenly the strange woman who waited for a ghost didn't seem so strange anymore. She had been right. She had held on when no one else believed. And in doing so, she had brought a man home, had given a family back to the world, had reminded everyone watching that sometimes love really is stronger than loss. As summer settled in, Maggie planned a small gathering in their backyard. It wasn't anything grand, just family, close friends, and a few of the people who had helped them on their journey. Daniel stood at the grill, laughing with Ethan. Laura arrived with a pie. James moved easily among the group, talking, smiling, occasionally placing a hand on Maggie's back in a gesture that said more than words ever could. When the sun dipped below the trees and fireflies began to blink in the dusk, Maggie raised her glass and said simply, "To truth, to love, and to never giving up." The clink of glasses, the hum of laughter, it was everything she had dreamed of in her loneliest nights. Later, As they sat under the stars, James wrapped an arm around her and said, "You saved me, Maggie." She turned to him, eyes glistening. "No," she whispered. "You saved yourself. I just refused to let the world forget you." And as the stars twinkled above them, ancient and eternal, they held each other in silence, hearts full, spirits whole. The war had taken much, but it had not taken everything. Love had endured. The truth had risen. And as dawn approached once more, it brought with it not just light, but peace, a new dawn indeed. And so, after all the years of waiting, searching, and holding on to hope, love found its way home. And in that quiet victory, a broken world began to heal. Thank you so much for watching and listening to this story all the way through. It means more than words can say. If it touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, feelings, or even your own story. Because stories like these matter and your voice matters too. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care of yourself and those you love.